right. Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan, and I'm an event manager with Politics and Prose. And I would like to welcome you all to PNP Live. Soon, I will drop a link in the chat for where you can order your copy of Post Traumatic. You can ask our speakers a question by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can towards the end of the program, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address your question. Also, there are auto captions for this event by hitting the live caption button at the bottom of your screen as well. Let me introduce tonight's guest. Chantal V. Johnson is a tenant lawyer and writer, a graduate of Stanford Law School and a 2019 Center for Fiction Emerging Writers Fellow. She lives in New York. Johnson will be in conversation with Myriam Gurba, an activist and writer from Long Beach, California. She is the author of several books, including a memoir called Meade, which was a New York Times editor's choice. She has been published by Time, the Paris Review, The Believer, and the Los Angeles Times. She loves wildflowers, strong coffee, and cash. Please give our guests a virtual round of applause.
Hi. I need to up my bio game. This is like, nobody cares where I went to law school. I need to start change it up a little bit. Wow.
You're wearing a Susie t-shirt.
I am. I did it for you.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
Yeah, I love Susie and the Banshees. And I saw on Twitter that you had a Susie and the Banshees poster when you were in high school or something.
I did. I found one at like the record store, and it was German. It was like this German concert poster. And I was like, I want that in my room. So I had that on the wall behind my dresser. And then my dresser had a quote from Dracula hand stenciled onto it. The dead travel faster. That was So yeah, I was totally a teenage goth.
You had your little goth? I was all over the place.
Okay.
So really I was a raver.
Mm-hmm.
But I did hang out with the goths because we all the rejects hung out at like the Smokers Bridge. And so it was just like a confluence of weirdos, you know? And like, so the ravers and the Alterna kids, and I listened to everything, and I kind of hung out with all of them and just kind of like rotated through the weird Alterna circles.
Exactly. There's always like an Alterna hodgepodge.
Yeah.
We find ourselves too. It's like where you see the smoke.
Yeah.
That's where you will find that hodgepodge.
Yeah.
That's so funny. So did you want to do a brief reading from a section of post-traumatic so that our audience can get a feel for the vibe of the book?
Yeah, cool. For sure. So thanks everyone for being with us. Thank you so much to Myriam for being in conversation with me. Thanks to Politics and Prose. And yeah, I'm going to read a brief excerpt from my novel, and then we'll just get the conversation going. So this is a section, this is kind of a little flashback describing how Vivian met her best friend, Jane, when they were in law school. Okay. Vivian and Jane met at a dorm room party in their first year of law school. The year Let England Shake came out. Only war album Vivian ever liked. Law school parties were weird because law school was weird. There were Christians and virgins and Christian virgins, aggressive men and closeted people. But there were also principled leftists and the smartest, most ambitious women that Vivian had ever known. It was a lot to handle. On this particular night, Vivian was having an okay time until she noticed this guy follow one of her profoundly drunk female classmates to the bathroom. And it felt like predation, so she followed them, watching. When the woman came out, the guy was there, waiting. He rubbed against her and tried to force a kiss. In response, the classmate laughed, pushing past him as if he were just an innocent commuter on a subway platform. Vivian was horrified that this woman who should feel threatened did not. After all, sexualizing someone out of the blue showed a fundamental lack of respect for women, the bounds of which were unknown. She couldn't enjoy the party after that, so she started following the guy around and eavesdropping on his conversations, which were, not surprisingly, decorated with gender slurs. At a certain point, after he said some bullshit, she just stared at him, and he noticed and thought it was weird. But he also clearly found her attractive as he took in her baby doll dress and her small frame, and his mind couldn't deal with the incongruity, so he quickly looked away, and she'd found it all pleasurable, almost erotic. He was in this cluster of people, and Vivian said loudly in the direction of the cluster, "Has anyone ever told you that you have the psychological profile of a misogynist from the 1980s? Vivian laughed as she said this, aware that she was abruptly changing the tone of the conversation and liking it. Contempt flashed across the guy's face as she spoke. His nostrils quickly flared in rejection of a bad or weird woman, but she kept smiling, buzzed on adrenaline. I've been listening to your stories. Your ex is a crazy stalker and your boss is such a bitch, right? I didn't even know they made people like you anymore. You sound like a woman hater from one of those made-for-TV movies about rape. He gave this look then that was like, if there weren't other people around, but there were, so he'd have to modulate his brutishness. You're fucking crazy, he said, bumping into her with his shoulder, glaring and walking with purpose toward the kitchen, where Vivian imagined him pounding a beer and setting it down on the counter. The women that 80s TV movie guy had been speaking to were still standing there. Vivian turned to them now, hopefully. He's the literal definition of a red flag, right? She said. And then, where's my rape whistle? I don't know, said one of them. That was a bit much. They made quick and furtive eye contact with one another and walked away. You had to feel bad for women like that. Decades of competition with other women, combined with a desire to maintain always a veneer of friendliness toward men, must have made them perceive Vivian as the enemy. Or maybe it wasn't jealousy at all, just the resentment bred by a woman who reminds you that you could be raped or that you have been. As Vivian smiled in awkward triumph, a diminutive Black woman with a short afro and a nose ring laughed from the corner of the room, kindly breaking the silence that Vivian had created. Jane was grinning uncontrollably. That was just the kind of entertainment I needed at this shit show. Do you smoke weed? As they passed a spliff back and forth on the fire escape, Jane analyzed Vivian's feminist prank, calling it an intervention. You're a killjoy, Jane said, inhaling to take a beat, like all the great stoner sages do. But it's political. The joy is misogyny. Jane's words felt like a benediction, offering an excuse, a reason, and a plan all in one, some kind of loophole against embarrassment, shame, and self-recrimination, after which she'd be forever changed. By the time they finished the joint, Vivian was hooked on Jane, and they'd been friends ever since. Over drinks in a dark bar soon after they met, Jane said she'd known she was gay since she was a kid, but her parents were in the church, devoted to sexual conformity. When her mom refused to let her get her hair buzzed into a fade, Jane did it herself. Afterward, her mom beat her. And I just want to give a little bit of a heads up that there's going to be a little bit of abuse and violence in the upcoming page or so. Jane had frequent lung infections growing up. Her mom would blame her for them or excoriate her for being weak or claim that she was faking and refuse to take her to the hospital until Jane's condition reached a crisis point. As she got older, the beating stopped, but she became the scapegoat of the family, the repository of all their failures and regrets. She knew what it was like to start dreading Thanksgiving in September. Vivian had softened toward Jane as she spoke and reciprocated with a bulleted account of her own history, all manner of violence by one of her mother's boyfriends, hitting and verbal humiliation. She wasn't allowed to eat when she'd done something bad, and that was just the stuff he did in front of other people. Death threats if she revealed that. And she'd even been abducted briefly and thought she was going to die. This was all decades ago, though. She'd recovered, she told Jane. Nothing to see here, she said, except for these burn scars. She laughed provocatively then and didn't break eye contact with Jane, who looked in the direction of her limbs. I have no clue how they got there, she said. Maybe a curling iron or something, Jane responded, examining her hand in a way no one had ever done before, dispassionately, as if she were just noticing a mysterious smudge on the wall. The women shared more details of their childhoods in a detached, clinical tone. There were no tears. Vivian was proud to have survived, took it as a measure of her strength, insisted she was over it. Jane's affect was minimal no matter what she was talking about. And in fact, she became more animated about the general injustices experienced by women and queer people than about anything that had ever happened to her. Vivian and Jane found their militancy reflected in each other, and it was glorious to be affirmed. They felt united together against everyone else and considered themselves the only people talking about rape, the only people brave enough to mention rape indiscriminately, whether in a classroom or at parties, in a crowded cafe or your grandmother's living room, while everyone else in the world is completely useless in this area. And though back then it was not done, and though they did it alone, their bond allowed them to cast off the shame of being the only people talking about rape, because it wasn't their shame. It was the shame of the world. I'll end there.
Thank you. So there are so many facets of the novel that I relished and that I enjoyed. And there was also a great sense of familiarity about so many of the characters, the settings, the dialogue, the sense of humor. And I'm curious, what part of the book or what element of the book do you most enjoy?
Yeah, that's such a great
question.
Proud of,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think parts like that. I think, I had never seen a kind of a friendship like that of two people who've experienced violence in their past coming together and like riffing about it and disclosing in a way that's like safe for them and like kind of capturing what a protected environment might look like for two characters who aren't like, I don't know, like in a support group or like, I think it's important for them that like, they're not crying while they're talking about this. They're both that they've metabolized their experiences in a very intellectual, cerebral way, but also kind of cheeky with jokes, and like they're really distancing themselves from what's happened to them as like a form of mastery over the experience. Like, and I think, in Vivian's case, it's unclear whether she's actually processed it or whether it's really just like the jokes are all like a distancing mechanism. But like the safety that they have in each other, that they both are like, okay, like you're not expecting me to cry, like, I'm not going to do that. And like, oh, you're just looking at like this scar that I have, and you're not like falling into hysterics about it. You're just like curious about how it might have happened. And I think just generally the dark humor of the book is something that I'm really proud of.
Yes.
I wanted to write. I wanted to write about the aftermath of violence in a way that felt fresh to me, and maybe a little irreverent, and maybe a little bit disrespectful, maybe a little bit, provocative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious. So, because I don't know what your path to publication was, and so I don't know like who read this book and how it made its way to your editor, but I'm curious about various readers that you've had and their responses to the humor, especially because so much of it is violent humor, morbid humor, macabre humor. And in my experience, writing about trauma and doing it using comic style is like that kind of work can be well received, but it can also be, so many people consider it like a provocation, and an inappropriate provocation at that.
Yeah.
And like I've had people I've had readers be more disturbed by the fact that there is humor writing about rape than they are about rape.
Yes. Yes.
More bothered by the tone in which like the narrative is being given rather than the content. And so I'm curious if you've clashed with anybody because of the humor.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote my book in isolation, really. And, I wrote my book while working full time. I don't have an MFA. I just kind of was working as a lawyer and writing my little thing, Yeah. And so no one close to me really saw it for quite some time. And I didn't even, I feel very lucky because when I did start sending it out, for the most part, I wasn't getting, like when I was sending out to agents, for instance, no one who rejected me mentioned that, mentioned the dark humor, they were just like, I need more plot, or like the generic, like liked it, but didn't love it kind of a thing. There's really only been maybe one or two people who said something specifically about the humor. Like when I was on submission, I think there was an editor who said, it's too dark for me, or something about the humor.
Yeah.
But I feel really lucky that, at least I didn't get those specific critiques. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the reviews.
Yes.
And the critical reception and the consumer reception.
Yeah.
Which remains to be seen. I think that someone's going to say something like that.
Probably.
Yeah. I expect it, I expect to be punished for violating the social norms of kind of what you were saying when we were talking in the green room, this idea of like, you were assaulted and now you get your wings, right? So this idea of like maybe a kind of purity.
Yes.
Like you need to be like the good kind of victim or survivor who's just kind of like grateful to be alive.
Oh,
you
need to adjust your rape halo. Like
exactly.
It's so gross.
Exactly. So yeah, I think it's a form of punishment. And it's a kind of social punishment, and I assume that someone's going to punish me in that way. But yeah. I'm ready.
Good. One of the other things that I find so galling about that chastisement for for bringing comedy to like post-traumatic narratives is that and you write about this so expertly, is that in our day-to-day lives, in like women's day-to-day lives, we constantly have to deal with unfunny men who we are coerced into propping up as if they were funny.
Yes.
Right? because we don't want to be murdered by them.
Right.
And then when we dare to be funny and actually succeed at it, we're chastised for it because we're inviting a spotlight, which is an aggressive act.
Yes.
But then we're somehow insulting people by also disclosing to or implying to our audience that we can find humor in darkness. And so I just find it so galling that like I have to laugh at what these assholes have to say. And so I will sometimes coach women to withhold humor strategically, not humor, withhold laughter.
Yes.
Like, don't give it to him. Like, don't give it to them.
Yes.
It is like I'll do it sometimes intentionally, and it sucks the air out of a room when you're the woman who's just like, not going to do it. I'm just going to sit here and let you know how unfunny you fucking are.
Yeah.
I do it for feminism.
Well, it's interesting. Like in the book, I think actually Vivian even is kind of talking about making those calculations, like when she's on the subway and she's imagining like that these men are like plotting to attack her, but then she starts talking about like the different circumstances of like the ogling and the leering and whether she'll respond or not. And it's kind of this assessment of like, do I think they'll lash out violently? And it's it's like, how do you even assess that as a risk? It's all just, so ephemeral, and who knows if you're ever correct. But she's talking about, it's like, it's like mathematics almost.
I was just it's an improvised calculus that you have to engage in.
Yeah.
And that was like one of the other things that I really appreciate about the book was like the mention of jazz. There are these mentions of bebop and jazz and improvisational music styles. And so much of survival is improvised in that very place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's like, should I laugh at the joke, or is it okay for me to not laugh? Is it okay for me to confront the way that she does at the party, know? But like, then there's multiple other situations where she doesn't feel safe.
Yes. And then there are those moments when you thought that you were safe to confront, or maybe you snapped, and then you're like, oh, fuck, am I going to die now? Yeah. So one of the things I'm always fascinated by when it comes to writers are like sort of literary genealogies and creative genealogies, and where writers place themselves. And so I was curious about like the your comedic influences and who you see yourself as being sort of like genealogically related to in terms of humor, but also in terms of writing.
Oh, I love that. I love that question so much. I've been thinking about, are you familiar with the comedian Myriam Bamford?
Yes.
Yeah. She was huge for me in the years leading up to me starting writing the book. I did go through a pretty intense period where I was just in love with stand-up. And I lived in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, just a walk away from this comedy club and bar called The Knitting Factory. And Hannibal Buress hosted like a comedy night that he curated every Sunday. And I went there every Sunday. And I saw amazing comedians there. And I think like Myriam Bamford was just someone who was like taking this very taboo thing of mental illness, anxiety, dark thoughts. And currently she's integrating a little bit more of kind of like a little bit more about like molestation, or at least like violation. Like she's been doing some humor about like being touched in ways that she hasn't wanted to. And so that's been cool to see her evolve. But at the time when I was starting to write, it was really just the idea of like, oh, you can make jokes about having anxiety. Like even that was just like, this is amazing. This is hysterical. I love that.
It feels like permission giving, like she's giving you permission to do that too. Yeah.
Exactly. And I had always wanted, I mean, and I say this in the book, like, who's going to be the great child abuse comedian of our time? Yeah. I've always been looking for that, actually, and not really finding it. Yeah. And so one of the things that, and Margaret Cho actually, she does have some abuse jokes that she does, but that kind of postdated me writing this. But she's someone who kind of stepped in to fill that space. I still want more, you know, because when I was growing up, there were so many rape jokes and so many abuse jokes, but it was all men threatening to rape women. Like that was like, there was just so many white dudes whose whole shtick was like, I'm going to make jokes about raping you.
Yeah.
And totally. I always wanted to see the response to that, you know? And so I tried to kind of do some of that in the book as like, I don't know, like reparations for myself or something. And then in terms of writing, I mean, it's just so broad, like my literary genealogy. I mean, you know, I keep talking about like someone like Ben Lerner, whose book 1004 was just really, I don't know, really inspiring to me. I wanted to write, I was like, well, I want to write a really cerebral, you know, like where someone's walking and thinking, but I want to take that walking and thinking and like thinking really interesting thoughts and have that come from a post-traumatic consciousness. So I want to take all of those books of like women thinking and walking or people thinking, like, you know, that very European kind of book where not much happens. But I wanted to filter that through a consciousness that is incredibly hypervigilant and suspicious and paranoid and unable to really be fully absorbed in thought because of the constant stream of external interruptions, both from men that my character experiences as threatening, but also from women that she experiences as judgmental, as constantly evaluating her body, and getting into that kind of like woman on woman crime.
that was a part of the book that I loved. Like I love the relationship with Jane. Like you were mentioning, that sort of conspiratorial, almost like a buddies, you know what I mean? Like we get, like dudes get to be buddies, but like we don't get to have these sort of buddy stories. And so like I enjoyed that, but I also enjoyed Paula Pauline.
Oh yeah.
Oh my God. Like she was just so easy to hate. I love that. I love characters who are easy to hate. This is why I love Real Housewives.
Oh my God.
Like that's like that's what enables me to relax, is to watch women with lots of plastic surgery fight one another. You know what I mean?
I think that Real Housewives is a revolution. I think Real Housewives has helped me like normalize conflict and it's been really de-shaming around conflict and around just being an absurd person. You know?
Totally. Yeah, because there are various like Real Housewives mentions in the novel. And then the Paula Pauline character, like I immediately hated her when she's having that conversation with Vivian and mentions wanting to have an adverse childhood experience so that she would have stories to tell.
Yes.
And I've been around this woman. Do you know what I mean? Like so many of us have been around this person who pines for pain.
Yes.
So that they'll become enriched by it.
Yes.
And like, and like that reminded me of one of the characters. I think in the film the Todd Solondz film, Happiness. Have you seen Happiness?
Yeah. I haven't seen it recently, but yes.
I think it's in Happiness where there is a female poet who only writes poetry about rape.
Oh
is that in Happiness?
I don't remember, but it sounds like that one because that's a big ensemble one. So
yeah.
Yeah.
That character, I think she's played by Lara Flynn Boyle. She's a poet who only writes about rape. It's mostly child rape. She's never been raped. And you get to hear like an interior monologue when she's like, raped at 9, raped at 10,
oh my
raped
gosh.
at 11. God, if only I'd been raped. Like she's so embittered.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, that needs to be an essay. Are you going to write it or am I? I don't know. We should collaborate though on maybe some kind of essay about this. Like, I'm calling it like the ressentiment of the non-traumatized.
Yes.
You know? And I think like, this is why we have these kind of like trauma grifters that they are arising as a class, right?
Yes.
And they are the ones who benefit from calling everything trauma.
Yes.
Because then they can finally have access to it.
Yes.
You know, whatever they think that we have.
Yes.
Which is like what they think we have is just always ridiculous. It's like, what do they want? They want moral authority. Like, I don't believe in that. Like,
yeah,
you know, or pity. And I'm like, oh, I don't want that.
Yeah.
You know? or just the cultural cachet of the moment.
Exactly.
Right?
And then you have the weird appropriation of the word grooming happening now. Have you?
Oh yeah. Everything is grooming now.
Everything is grooming now. If I say good morning to you, I've groomed you. Like, you know what I mean? Like, oh God, it fucking pisses me off. And speaking of that,
yeah,
I'm curious, like, about the thought that you've given to sexual assault myths, because so much of your novel addresses those myths through showing and not telling, right? So through Vivian's lived experiences, you shatter and debunk so many of those myths. But I'm curious to hear from you, which of those sexual assault myths do you find like the most pernicious or just the most annoying, where you're like, oh God, not this fucking story again, or this trope, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely wrote my book against some of the not so much sexual assault tropes, but like the tropes of trauma fiction that I had seen when I was growing up. And so these are tropes that really predate Carol Sagal's trauma plot essay. These were more like the Ghost Girl books, where like it starts where the little girl has been murdered by a pedophile, and then you're essentially reading to watch Susie Salmon get like, you know, abducted and murdered, you know. So that was like one of the, you know, when I'm like surveying the world of trauma fiction, it's like, well, what are the options? Like what's been done, you know? And so it's like
Bones. Yeah. So
it's we have Lovely Bones, and then we have, you know, really wonderful books about like bad childhoods, you know, that are just like, but from the perspective of a child. And I wasn't interested in that. I wasn't interested in doing anything super graphic.
Yes.
And so I kind of wanted to reject that whole approach. I mean, I'm just not interested in that as an approach. What I was interested in was adults who really have achieved some level of distance and mastery, but still they're struggling. But they're very much alive, you know, like they're not dead little girls who are coming back from you know, like they're not that, it's not an angel looking down at her town after she's been like, I just, you know, that's something that I wanted to kind of.
Yeah, most of us don't get killed. Like some of us, most of us do. So let's
exactly
in the survivor's life. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And like, you know, obviously like surviving is really only the beginning, which is like another thing that I was interested in thinking about. Like in some ways that's kind of that's one of the arcs of the book, you know.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like surviving is not the same as really living authentically.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm curious about your answer to that question.
Oh gosh. Well, I am annoyed by so many of them, and I think that they're all pernicious, although some are a lot more damaging than others. But I think that not so much a myth as a misunderstanding about sexual assault that just bugs the shit out of me is this belief that the worst part of it is the violence itself, that there's this discrete period of time during which a person is being assaulted and the harm is sort of contained within that time and space. And then once we're free of that time and space, one is safe enough to heal, when in reality, it is assault's aftermath that is, for most of us, the most difficult part.
Yeah.
And what's taken from us in the aftermath, because so many of us ultimately lose income. Like we either lose our employment, we lose our housing, we lose family, we lose friends, we lose our social milieu. And I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's an anti-rape activist, and one of the ideas that she stresses a lot is that it's really expensive to get raped. It's really expensive, and it's not something that you save up for.
Yes. That's such a valuable perspective. And it made me everything that you just said made me think of another thing that I was kind of not interested in or kind of rejecting was this idea of like empathy with the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And I think there's a certain kind of writing that thinks that is like the most revolutionary or interesting way that you could write about assault is to demonstrate that you can have empathy with monstrosity, as they'll kind of say. And I have so little interest in that. and I also just think that it's kind of a response to a problem that doesn't exist. Like, I just don't think that empathy with the perpetrator is something that is like lacking.
No deficit. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, it's false scarcity. It's like so many perpetrators are just like hiding.
They're a bunch of Grammys. Like, what are we talking about? There's plenty of empathy for them. They're all back on.
Or like nobody knows what they've done. And so all everyone sees is the mask. And so the empathy with the perpetrator is the status quo, y'all.
Thank you.
So exactly. I'm not gonna write something that is a response to a problem that is overstated.
Yeah, exactly. I will, and what I've done in some of my writing is I will explore like the offender or the perpetrator. And because I'm I do have some curiosity as to like the why, but I often think that the why is so much less complicated than we're led to believe. Like, there's so much bullshit folk wisdom. It's not wisdom at all, because I think it's false, that if we were to just try to understand, we would find this, incredible complexity in the lives of perpetrators. And I just don't think it's true. I think that sexual assault and that sort of harm happens for very obvious reasons. But yeah, I have explored like the lives of offenders and perpetrators, and I'll do that, but I'll kind of still acknowledge that like I'm not doing this as like an empathetic gesture. I'm doing it more because I'm curious.
Yeah.
And I still hate these fuckers.
Yeah, like that's an interesting aesthetic and intellectual response, is a response of curiosity,
yeah.
or like investigation, or like documentation.
Yeah,
like intellectual dominance,
totally.
mastery, or something.
Yeah, like because I wrote about how I was sexually assaulted by a stranger, which is like an unusual way to be assaulted, right?
Yeah.
And so I, in the years after that happened, I became very preoccupied with what had happened because it was such an unusual type of assault that I had gone through. And I had a fantasy about confronting him, right? Because he was in San Quentin, he was on death row. So I had this big fantasy about sitting across from him at a table and asking him why. But in my fantasy, I knew he was going to give me a really disappointing answer. And so like, that's where my fantasy would often go was toward a disappointing answer. But like I had that in mind. And then I think for me, the other reason that like I was so sort of fixated on it and wanting to like see him face to face was because the first time I met him, he assaulted me and that was it. So I wanted to get to know him a little better. Like, we spent 15 minutes together in 1996. Tell me some more about yourself.
Favorite color? Like, can I get a?
I know about you, but you know a lot about me.
Yeah, absolutely. See, and it's just those kinds of like, I don't know, just kind of like an askew kind of a look at it, like that's where the aesthetically interesting and invigorating work comes from.
Yes, I agree.
But it's deeply disrespectful. Like it's so, like, and for me, I just love that.
Yeah.
Like that's what the best art is. It has that risk. Like, and then I was thinking about another influence on me, Ana Mendieta. And there is some references to visual art in my book where I'm kind of like Vivian's making fun of the art that she hates, and she's kind of like, what? Like, she's just not into the conceptual art. Like, I don't know, stockings hanging from a hanger or whatever. I don't know, whatever it is. But like Ana Mendieta and all of these artists from like the 70s who were really interested in using sexual assault in their visual art had such a profound influence on me whenever I was younger. And I kind of want, I'm just kind of dreaming of a literature that is doing kind of revolutionary things with this extreme experience.
I think that a lot of us who are interested in this kind of writing, because we don't have many works to turn to that era of visual art, because those women had a willingness to engage with those tropes and that subject matter, and did it in such a visceral way. Yeah. And I'm going to encourage the audience to ask questions and to place them in the Q&A. I see that there's a few in there. And then before I dive in there, I'm going to go ahead and ask another question, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And it's that, and I know that I'm not alone in this. I know that there are a lot of other survivors who feel this way. I've had this conversation with other survivors that it is unpleasant to me, being a survivor, to be complimented on my strengths. It is unpleasant to me. I sometimes cringe when I am told that I am a very resilient person. And especially when there is sort of like a congratulatory element to the statement or to the compliment. And I have actually told people before, I don't want you to congratulate me for my strength. I want to know what you're doing to help support survivors in the aftermath of what has happened to us. I want to know how you are doing that in a sustained way instead of high-fiving us as survivors. I think that's what it is. Oh, you're so good at getting raped. High five. You know what I mean? Like, ew.
Right.
God, you know?
Right.
And so that bothers me. But when the compliment is delivered without sort of condescension, and delivered with less sort of congratulatory fluff surrounding it, I have an easier time metabolizing that compliment. But I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that balance between honoring and admiring the strength of survivors and their resilience, because I do think that that those traits ought to be honored and admired, but so frequently that admiration tips into idealization and fetishization.
Yeah.
And so how do we maintain that balance, and how do we teach people about that? How do we teach people who are not survivors that don't want to be fetishized and we don't want to be idealized, because it's a really ugly kind of objectification of our strengths?
Yeah, I mean, while you were talking, I was thinking about people who kind of survivors and victims who politicize or contextualize their assaults in a larger context of violence against oppressed people, and those who don't. Yeah. And that is a real divide. I am definitely someone who and I think, Vivian, in the excerpt that I wrote, Vivian and Jane start to kind of go in on the way that their violence is part of a lot of other violence that's going on in the world. And so my characters definitely see themselves almost in as part of a survivor diaspora. You know what I mean? Totally. And I think when you see yourself like that, then the idea of individual strength feels less important, because or less relevant. I mean, I think even in the excerpt that I read, Vivian she's very proud of her strength, but she recognizes that there are systems and structures that keep people from being able to live and to survive, and to live authentically and to live in freedom. I think if you don't see yourself as part of this kind of diaspora, then what happened to you is just kind of what happened to you. So then your strength really matters. I mean, it really comes to take on a lot of significance.
Bootstrapping. You bootstrap your way out of rape, and it's
but it's also part of the structure of rape and assault is to make people feel alone. It's a very isolating, abuse,
atomize us.
Assault or isolating experience. So then on the other hand, it's almost expected that the reaction, especially because so many people have a shameful withdrawal, interiorized internal response, and I just want to be but that's what they want, but I also don't want to police people's responses. Totally. So it's very difficult and it's very tricky, and I don't know the answer, but I think for me personally and for my characters, having a sense of political context, political consciousness, and a sense of commonality with other people makes the idea of individual strength matter a lot less.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and turn to the questions in the Q&A. And the first one is a comment. Chantal, you are so awesome. That's from Sarah. And then from Nadra, do you add an element of yourself to your characters?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the humor is humor. I mean, not only myself, but my friends. My greatest inspiration is my friends. And I've taken some of their jokes, and I think a lot of the sensibility of the book, I would say, is like, it's kind of like my sensibility, which is different from like the plot parts, because a lot of that is very kind of divergent from my actual life. But I think in the literary style, in the sensibility, in the tone and the mood, like that is very much me. That's who I am.
And then there is, and this is kind of related to what we were discussing earlier, although it ropes the internet into the question, which is, do you think that the constant discussions of trauma via the internet, do you think that these discussions have caused people to stretch the meanings of words like grooming or triggered?
I do. I think the internet and like digital culture is just it's a proliferating culture, and it's a democratized space, so everybody can weigh in, and I think that that's great in a lot of ways, but I think it's also diluting in a lot of ways. And I've been thinking about how we can protect, like, what is the response? Like, do we want to be protecting terms? Do we want to protect the term trauma? So do we want to limit what trauma is, or do we need to create new terms? Because if trauma is becoming this kind of gauzy euphemism that almost means nothing, and so something that I'm thinking about doing is really specifying what I mean when I'm talking about trauma. So like, is that a potential solution? Do we just kind of like say, like, when I say trauma, I mean like violence and assault and threats to bodily integrity and proximity to death? Like, should I just do that? Well, I just did it. Which is separate from something like the stress of like a divorce.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And so that we're carving out, like, this is what I mean when I say this. So I think that's potentially one solution, is to just try to be as specific as possible when we are using these words that other people are now kind of taking away from us and diluting, because they want in on whatever they think that we have.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't use the word triggered that much, but I use the word trauma frequently enough that I've started to implement that strategy of defining my terms, because like you said, that there's a proliferation of definitions, and they have since become competing definitions, right?
Yes.
And so I'm pretty explicit now when I like enter into a piece of work and I'm going to write about trauma, I will state I am talking about high stakes. I'm talking about mortality. I'm talking about people facing their mortality. If people are not facing their mortality, then according to the definition I'm using, we're not talking about trauma. So that's also the approach that I've taken. But I think that it can be difficult to be challenged, as the internet starts to cannibalize language and words start to take on new meanings. But I also think that there's like some delight in the challenge of generating new language.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of delight in that, to be able to discuss survivorship with more nuance by developing this language. So I'm always enthusiastic about language projects like this.
I agree. 100%. Yeah.
Okay, so next question is from May, and it is, I love that you mentioned the cost of being raped and the aftermath. In my writing, I concentrate on my trauma and never focused on what the rape cost me in other aspects of my life other than the corporeal. Thank you for highlighting this point of view. I think it's important to illustrate and discuss the true cost of rape. And one of the things that I find like, Oh, one of the pieces of information that I came across was that, there was this amazing essay that had been written by a survivor who had been assaulted when she was an undergrad. She had been she'd been raped while on a date, and that had the aftermath and PTSD had impacted her so severely that she was unable to graduate, and she found it very difficult to work. So steady employment was difficult for her, and she had done some just arithmetic to sum up what the cost of recovery would be for her. So she's a person living on disability. She's left school. She's a very difficult time with livelihood. And she had determined that for her to recover from what had happened, it was going to cost her $250,000.
Wow.
And so she wrote to her rapist and she said, "You owe me $250,000.
Yes. Yes.
He gave her some money.
Really?
He gave her some money. Yeah. But I've had some interesting conversations with survivors who have contacted, their perpetrators years after, and the conversations are really interesting. I was facilitating a workshop where there was a survivor whose, life had been derailed by rape, and she had tried all these different healing modalities. They weren't working for her, and so she decided, I'm gonna write to this motherfucker and tell him what he did to me and what he's done to me and what this has cost me, like what that one night has cost me.
Yeah.
So she emails him and he writes her back. And he's really distraught that she's calling him a rapist.
Well, yeah. Sounds.
Take it back. Because he had recently been in a car accident that he was trying to heal from, and he told her he couldn't heal if she called him a rapist.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
There was this back and forth, and I was like, wait a minute, you're arguing about trauma and healing with your rapist? I was like, this is gold.
That's great material. It's great material. That's just another bizarre angle. You know what I mean? And like, we're entitled to the bizarre.
Exactly.
We're entitled to like a Seinfeld episode
exactly
of your assault. I mean, because I think that, the last thing that I will say is like this idea of restitution, like in the civil legal structure, in the legal system, it exists to try to restore people back to where they were before. Which we know is impossible with certain kinds of harms. But the idea is that money would give you some kind of compensation.
Yep.
Right. And it's an interesting question of what justice looks like for victims and survivors who either don't go through any kind of carceral process and don't really go. I mean, as most of us just kind of, things happen to us and we just have to move through the world with no justice, with no restitution.
Exactly.
But what would justice and restitution look like in a just world?
I love this woman invoiced. Invoiced him.
I love that.
Okay, I'm sorry to jump in. There's still a lot of good questions in that Q&A box, so apologies to our audience. But I would like to get in the last question. We'd just like to ask our author and our moderator what you all are reading before we wrap up this event.
Yeah, I currently am not really reading. But I, before I started doing my book promotion, I've been working through all of Percival Everett's books. So I'm trying to read them all. because I read The Trees by him and really just so fell in love with it. And it's a mixture of a police procedural and like a supernatural lynching revenge story that takes place in Mississippi. And it's really darkly funny, but it's also, it kind of moves from being in one kind of genre of a kind of comic police procedural where these Black detectives are investigating the mysterious murders of white people. But it kind of evolves into something a bit more, maybe even spiritual, and really resonant. And I'm sorry, I think one of my neighbors is yelling. I don't know if you can hear that, so I may mute myself when Myriam goes. But yeah, I think I would recommend that. And also his novel Erasure, which is a satire of the publishing industry that is still deeply relevant. Let's say.
I reread Chantal's book and I have it right here. So yes. So I hope that everybody has ordered this book.
Yes, thank you for that plug, Myriam, because the link is in the chat to purchase Post-Traumatic. Thank you, Chantal, for doing this event with us. We appreciate you doing this with Politics in Prose. And thank you as well, Myriam, for moderating this great and humorous conversation between both of you. And thank you, everybody at home who is watching. Your patronage is what makes these events possible. And we always appreciate when you all tune in. And on that note, we all wish you a great Friday night.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all. Thank you so much. Bye, Myriam.